Hi, I'm Greg Coletti. Welcome to American Muscle Cars Volume Number 4. In this production, we're going to give you a hands-on, step-by-step journey through the disassembly, reassembly required to rebuild a AA-arm coil spring front suspension. We're also offering technical highlights on other types of popular front suspensions. These are the components we'll be working with when rebuilding our front suspension. First, let's take a look at the sway bar or anti-roll bar and the fact that it is attached to the chassis in 2 locations via a bushing and bracket assembly. Next, the sway bar is attached to the lower control arms via the link bolts. The link bolts consist of a long through bolt with a spacer and multiple washers and bushings. Next, we have our tie rod assemblies, which consists of an outer and inner tie rod, an adjusting sleeve, and locking clamps. We also have our shock absorbers and mounting hardware. We have our steering knuckle assembly, which consists of the spindle, the knuckle mount, which attaches to the lower and upper ball joint, our steering or knuckle arm, which attaches to the steering linkage via the tie rod in this location. We have coil springs, lower control arm assemblies, left and right, which consist of the control arm itself, the lower ball joint and hardware. On some applications, a bump stop, and the front and rear lower control arm bushings. Next, we have our upper control arm assembly, left and right, which consist again of the control arm itself, the ball joint and mounting hardware. An upper control arm shaft assembly, which consists of the shaft, bushings, and retaining hardware. In the upper control arm area, we also have a bump stop, which in some applications mounts below the upper control arm to the chassis, and in other applications mounts directly to the underside of the upper control arm. During disassembly, pay particular attention to the positioning and location of all components. These components must be reinstalled in the original position and location during reassembly. Now, let's look at all the replacement parts we're going to use to rebuild our front suspension. Here are all the new parts we're going to use in our front end rebuild. We have shock absorbers, sway bar bushings and mounting brackets, sway bar links, inner and outer tie rods, adjusting sleeves with clamps. In the lower control arm, we have new bump stops, front and rear bushings, and ball joints. In the upper control arm, we have new ball joints, shaft bushings, and bump stops. We are using Performance Suspension Technologies polygraphite bushings in our front end rebuild. They are a premium polyurethane bushing and a vast improvement over the stock rubber bushings. Next, we're going to show you some special tools required to perform the rebuild. Here are the special tools required for the front end rebuild. First, we have the tie rod assembly as it was removed from our vehicle. We're going to use that to set the length of our new assemblies to aid us in realignment. Next, we need a coil spring compressor that is designated for your application. This is a ball joint fork, which we use to separate the ball joints and the tie rods. And here is an economical substitute for expensive professional bushing and ball joint drivers. To install the lower ball joint in this application, the ball joints are pressed into the control arm. To do that, we need a tool that will locate itself around this area of the ball joint without contacting the soft center. This pipe bushing lends itself readily to this application. We need this block of steel for all our bushing driving to span across our installation tool so that when we strike it in the center with a hammer, it spreads the applying force evenly around the component. Next, we have a bearing race that we're going to use to install the upper control arm bushing. The bushing must be installed by applying force to this rim around the bushing sleeve without contacting the soft polyurethane insert. This particular bearing race does that very nicely. It contacts the sleeve and locates us on the bushing. For the lower control arm bushing, we don't have a very big sleeve to contact. However, this bearing race that we picked out of our garbage bin fits this application very nicely also. The last economical but exotic tool you'll need is the memory tape. The memory tape is simply a piece of duct tape that we've marked left and right side on. This is going to be for the upper control arm components related to the shims to be redeposited back in their original location to aid in final alignment. This is where our front shims will go from the upper control arm on the left side and the rear shims. Consequently, the right upper control arm, these will be our rear and front shims. The S mark down here is going to be for the compressed length of the coil spring from that side. So when we go to reinstall the spring, we know how far to compress it to aid in proper reinstallation. Next, we're going to have a few tips on safety. There are 6 basic rules to follow when using a spring compressor. First, make sure that the compressor you're going to use is of proper design for the application. 2, before using the compressor, inspect it for proper safe condition. 3, before you compress a spring, make sure that the compressor is installed properly. This means that the spring is fully engaged by all fingers of the compressor. 4, never compress the spring more than necessary to facilitate proper removal and reinstallation of the spring. 5, never leave the spring loaded with the compressor any longer than absolutely necessary to do the job. 6, and most important, never have a loaded spring facing you or anyone else. Always make sure that the ends of the springs face away from you. If the compressor were to fail while the spring is loaded, the spring is going to jump across the room or in any direction. You want it moving away from you. Next, we'll look into another safety tip. This is a lower control arm bolt. It's not new, it's used. However, the whole shank area of the bolt and thread area is in perfect condition. This bolt we can reuse. Now, let's take a look at a bolt that's been eroded over time. This bolt is deeply pitted and the threads are distorted. This bolt should be discarded and another bolt that was designed for this application should be installed. If this bolt were to fail, your front suspension would also fail. Always check your hardware before reinstallation. To safely raise your vehicle, consult your owner's manual for proper jacking points. When using a floor jack to raise your vehicle, raise it from the frame or crossmember. Always use support jacks under the vehicle before working on it. Always use support jacks in pairs. At no time ever rely on the jack alone. At no time ever use cinder blocks to support your vehicle. Throughout this project, you're going to be working with hammers, chisels, and in very dirty areas. So at all times, you should wear proper eye safety equipment. Enough said. The anti-roll bar is connected to the chassis at 2 locations with a metal bracket and accompanying bushing. The bracket's held to the chassis in the front and the back of the bushing with bolts. The anti-roll bar is then connected to the lower control arm via a link assembly. Mounted to the bottom of the lower control arm with 2 bolts is a shock absorber, which can be seen running vertically through the spring. The top of the shock is mounted to the chassis with the nut and bushing assembly. The coil spring is located between the chassis at the top and a matching area in the lower control arm. The lower control arm is mounted to the chassis in the front area and the rear area of the lower control arm with through bolts. The steering knuckle is attached to the lower control arm via the lower ball joint. The steering arm is attached to the outer tie rod at this location. The tie rod continues in toward the center of the vehicle through the adjusting sleeve, continuing through the inner tie rod, which attaches in this area to the remainder of the steering linkage. Here's a top view of our suspension and steering. Take note of the anti-roll bar attaching to the lower control arm through the link, the tie rod adjusting sleeve, the outer tie rod, where it attaches to the steering arm. The steering arm is bolted to our spindle assembly. The spindle assembly at the top is attached to our upper control arm at this location through the upper ball joint. The upper control arm is attached to the chassis via the upper control arm shaft assembly, and it's attached to the chassis with 2 stud and nut assemblies. At this location, we're actually looking at the top of the shock absorber, the attaching nut, upper washer, and bushing. Turning our front wheel, we'll get a better view of the brake caliper and its mountings in relationship to the spindle. From this view, we can witness our brake caliper. It is attached to the steering knuckle through a mounting bracket by 2 bolts, one located at the top of the caliper and one at the bottom.